As evening settles around you, I invite you to find a comfortable position. Perhaps adjust your pillows, allow your shoulders to relax, and let the quiet of the night begin to embrace you. Tonight we'll be exploring a particular mourning custom that appeared across many cultures and time periods, the practice of covering mirrors in a house where someone had died. This tradition, found in various forms from Victorian England to Jewish communities to households across different continents, represents one way that communities navigated the immediate period following death. Tonight we'll be exploring a particular mourning custom that appeared across many cultures and time periods, the practice of covering mirrors in a house where someone had died. This tradition, found in various forms from Victorian England to Jewish communities to households across different continents, represents one way that communities navigated the immediate period following death. Over the next few hours, we'll move slowly through various aspects of this custom. We'll consider the beliefs that motivated it, the practical actions involved, the different cultural contexts where it appeared, and the psychological dimensions of grief and mourning that it addressed. This is not a journey meant to disturb or frighten, but rather to understand how people in different times and places created rituals to mark the transition from life to death. The custom of covering mirrors provides a window into how communities understood death, the soul, and the boundary between the living and the dead. It also reveals something about mirrors themselves, how these reflective surfaces held meanings beyond their practical function, becoming objects laden with symbolism and spiritual significance. So take a deep breath. Let your mind settle into this quieter pace, and as we move through this exploration together, we'll simply observe what these practices meant to the communities that maintain them without judgment about beliefs different from our own, recognizing them as part of the diverse ways humans have responded to death and loss. It seems appropriate to begin with the practice as it actually occurred, what people did when they did it, and how it looked in the household where someone had died. When death occurred in a home, one of the immediate tasks, alongside laying out the body and notifying family members, was covering the mirrors. This was typically done very soon after death, sometimes within minutes or hours. The urgency suggests the importance communities placed on this practice. The actual process was straightforward. Cloth would be draped over mirrors throughout the house. The fabric used varied by household and circumstance. Wealthier families might use black cloth, fitting with formal mourning customs. Others might use whatever fabric was available, white sheets, dark towels, any material that would effectively cover the reflective surface. The coverage was meant to be complete. A mirror partially covered would not serve the purpose. The entire reflective surface needed to be hidden from view. This attention to completeness indicates that the covering wasn't merely symbolic, but was understood to serve a specific protective or preventive function. The extent of coverage varied by tradition and household. In some cases, all mirrors in the house would be covered. In others, only mirrors in certain rooms, perhaps the room where the body lay, or the main living areas. Some traditions specified covering all reflective surfaces, which might include polished metal, glass windows, even still water in bowls. The act of covering the mirrors often fell to specific family members or to women in the household. In some communities, this was one of the ritual tasks that marked the transition from ordinary time to the sacred time of mourning. The physical act of draping fabric over mirrors became part of the larger set of actions that acknowledged death and prepared the household for the mourning period. The atmosphere in which this occurred is worth considering. A house where death has just occurred holds a particular quality, a stillness, a sense of disruption to normal life, an awareness that something fundamental has changed. Into this atmosphere, family members would move through rooms covering mirrors. The dimming of these reflective surfaces added to the altered quality of the space. Rooms with covered mirrors take on a different character. Light doesn't bounce and multiply in the same way. The space feels more enclosed, more muted. This physical change in the environment reinforced the sense that the household had entered a different state, separated temporarily from ordinary life. The duration of mirror covering varied by tradition. In some cases, mirrors remained covered until after the funeral. In Jewish tradition during shivah, the 7-day mourning period, mirrors stay covered for the entire week. In other contexts, the covering might last only until the body was removed from the house, or for a specific number of days, determined by custom. The removal of the coverings, when that time came, was another ritual moment. Uncovering the mirrors marked a transition, not the end of mourning, which might continue for months or years, but the end of the most immediate acute phase. The return of reflection to the house signalled a partial return to ordinary domestic life. It is worth noting that this practice existed within broader sets of mourning customs. Covering mirrors was one element among many. Stopping clocks, closing curtains, wearing specific clothing, restricting certain activities. Each element contributed to marking the household and the family as being in a state of mourning. The practice was not universal, even within communities where it was known. Some families might observe it strictly, while others did it partially or not at all. Individual belief, degree of religious observance, and personal preference all influenced whether and how thoroughly mirrors were covered. Regional and temporal variations also existed. The practice might be nearly universal in one area or time period, while being uncommon in another. The late 19th century, for instance, saw elaborate mourning customs in many Western societies, and mirror covering was often part of these formalized practices. The participation of the entire household in observing this custom is significant. Children would grow up experiencing this practice, learning that mirrors must be covered when death occurred. This transmission across generations maintained the tradition and embedded it in cultural memory. Visitors to a house in mourning would encounter these covered mirrors immediately. The draped reflective surfaces served as visible markers that this was not an ordinary household at the moment. Death had visited here, and normal social rules were suspended. What we observe in the practice itself is a physical transformation of domestic space in response to death. The covering of mirrors changed how rooms looked and felt, creating an environment that physically manifested the household's altered state. This visible, tangible action provided a clear marker of transition and a framework for the early stages of grief. As evening grows quieter, we might simply observe this practice as it occurred. The quiet movement through dimmed rooms, the draping of fabric over glass, the transformation of familiar spaces into something different, marked by absence and change. Let us turn now to the beliefs that motivated this practice, how people understood the relationship between the soul, death, and mirrors. A central belief in many traditions was that the soul did not depart immediately at the moment of death. Rather, it lingered in or near the body or in the house for some period of time. This liminal period between death and final departure created a situation that required careful management. The duration of this lingering varied by belief system. Some traditions held that the soul remained for 3 days, others 7, others 40. The specific time frame mattered less than the general understanding that there was a transitional period during which the deceased soul was still present in some form. During this period, the soul was understood to be in a vulnerable or confused state, having just separated from the body not yet having reached its final destination, whether that was heaven, the afterlife, reincarnation, or some other state. The soul needed to complete a journey. Anything that might impede or complicate this journey was to be avoided. Mirrors entered this framework as potentially problematic objects. The belief that mirrors could trap or confuse a wandering soul appears across multiple traditions. The reasoning varied, but certain themes recur. Some believed that mirrors, being reflective surfaces that showed images, might confuse the soul about its own nature. The soul, seeing its reflection, might not understand that it was no longer embodied. This confusion could delay or prevent the soul's proper departure to whatever realm awaited it. Others held that mirrors could literally trap the soul. The reflective surface might capture or hold the soul, preventing it from moving on. This belief treated mirrors as having a kind of spiritual stickiness. They could catch and hold immaterial beings much as they caught and held visual images. Still, other traditions viewed mirrors as doorways or thresholds. If the physical world and the spiritual world were understood as separate but occasionally permeable realms, mirrors might be points where these realms touched. A soul trying to depart might become confused by these thresholds or might pass through into the wrong realm. The concept of mirrors as thresholds connects to broader beliefs about boundaries and transitions. Doorways, windows, and mirrors all shared this threshold quality. They marked boundaries between different spaces or states. At times of transition, like death, special attention to these threshold points became important. Within this worldview, covering mirrors served a protective function for the departing soul. By hiding the reflective surfaces, the household removed potential obstacles or traps. The soul could depart cleanly without becoming entangled in mirrors or confused by reflections. This protection wasn't just about ensuring the soul's comfort. There was often concern that a soul that failed to depart properly might become a troublesome presence. A trapped or confused soul might manifest as a ghost or spirit that haunted the location. Proper death rites, including covering mirrors, helped ensure that the dead truly departed. Some traditions also believed that mirrors could show or reveal things that normally remained unseen. A mirror in a house where death had occurred might show not just the physical room, but also spiritual presences, the lingering soul of the deceased, or potentially other spirits attracted to the threshold moment of death. This revelatory quality of mirrors made them potentially disturbing objects during mourning. Seeing something in a mirror that shouldn't be there, a shadow, a movement, an unexpected reflection, could be deeply unsettling to grieving family members. Covering mirrors prevented such experiences. The belief in mirrors as spiritually active objects, not merely passive reflective surfaces, underlay all these concerns. Mirrors weren't just glass that happened to reflect light. They were objects with particular properties in the spiritual realm, objects that required careful handling during sensitive times. Different religious and cultural traditions incorporated these beliefs in various ways. Jewish tradition's practice of covering mirrors during shivah connects to beliefs about the soul's journey and about maintaining proper focus during mourning. Victorian spiritualist movements, which believed in communication with the dead, had complex ideas about mirrors as potential tools for seeing or contacting spirits. Folk traditions across Europe maintained beliefs about mirrors and death, often without elaborate theological frameworks. These beliefs were simply accepted as part of how things worked. When someone died, you covered the mirrors just as you stopped the clocks or closed the curtains. The specific mechanisms might be understood differently across traditions, but certain patterns recur. Mirrors and souls interact in potentially problematic ways. The period immediately after death is spiritually delicate. protective actions are necessary to ensure proper transitions. It is worth noting that these beliefs were seriously held by people who practice mirror covering. These weren't quaint superstitions, but genuine spiritual concerns. Families covered mirrors because they believed it mattered for the soul's journey and for the household's spiritual safety. What we observe in these beliefs is an attempt to understand and manage the transition from life to death. In the absence of modern scientific frameworks for understanding death, communities developed spiritual frameworks that provided explanations and prescriptions for behavior. Covering mirrors made sense within these frameworks. It was rational action based on accepted understandings of how souls and mirrors worked. As we move deeper into evening, we might simply acknowledge these beliefs as they were held seriously with conviction as part of comprehensive worldviews about life, death, and the spiritual dimensions of existence. Let us consider now a darker or more complex dimension of mirror beliefs, the idea that mirrors might not just affect the dead, but could attract or reveal other presences. Beyond concerns about the deceased soul, some traditions held that mirrors at the time of death became particularly active or dangerous. The death of a person was understood to thin the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead or of spirits. Mirrors, already understood as threshold objects, might become especially permeable during this thinning. This meant that an uncovered mirror in a house where death had occurred might attract spirits or entities other than the deceased's own soul. The moment of death, the presence of a body, the grief and emotional intensity, all of this might draw spiritual attention. An uncovered mirror could serve as an entry point for these attracted presences. The nature of these other spirits varied by tradition. Some were understood as neutral or simply curious. Others might be malevolent, seeking opportunities to enter the world of the living. Still others might be previously deceased family members or local spirits with connections to the household. Regardless of their nature, their presence was generally unwelcome and potentially disturbing. The concept here is of death as creating an opening or vulnerability in the normal boundaries that separated different realms of existence. Every day, the living world and the spiritual world remained mostly separate and distinct, but at moments of transition, birth, death, certain ritual times, the boundary became thinner or more permeable. Mirrors, as reflective surfaces that showed what was present but in reversed or altered form, already had an uncanny quality. They showed the world but not quite as it was, reversed, two-dimensional, capturing images in glass. This liminal quality made them suitable candidates for being points where different realms might touch or cross. During the vulnerable period after a death, mirrors might reveal things that would normally remain unseen. A grieving family member glancing at a mirror might see movement or shadow that had no physical source. This could be interpreted as seeing through to the spiritual realm that had become temporarily more accessible. Such experiences would be deeply disturbing. The household was already dealing with the immediate shock and grief of death. Adding to this, the possibility of encountering unexpected presences in mirrors would compound the distress. Covering mirrors removed this possibility, protecting the household from additional sources of fear or disturbance. There was also a sense in which uncovered mirrors might invite or encourage spiritual activity. If mirrors could serve as doorways or viewing points between realms, leaving them uncovered might be seen as an invitation, either intentional or inadvertent, for spirits to use these portals. This protective aspect of covering mirrors served the living as much as the dead. The practice created a safer, more contained environment for the household during the vulnerable period of early mourning. By covering the mirrors, the family erected a kind of spiritual barrier, closing off potential points of contact with the unseen. The stillness of a house in mourning contributed to this sense of permeability. Normal household activities ceased or were greatly reduced. Quietness prevailed. This stillness created an atmosphere where unusual experiences might seem more likely or more noticeable. In a silent house, a glimpse of movement in a mirror would be startling. The emotional vulnerability of those in grief also mattered. People in the immediate aftermath of loss are in a heightened emotional state. Raw, sensitive, disoriented. In such a state, ordinary experiences might take on uncanny qualities. A reflection glimpsed in peripheral vision, a play of light and shadow. These might be misinterpreted or might genuinely feel threatening. Covering mirrors protected grieving individuals from experiences that might disturb their fragile emotional state. Whether the spiritual dangers were real or whether the danger was primarily psychological, the practical effect was similar. Covered mirrors meant fewer potentially disturbing encounters. Some traditions also included beliefs about mirrors and the evil eye, or about mirrors and magical practices. Death might attract the attention of practitioners of harmful magic, or might create opportunities for cursing or spiritual attack. Covered mirrors denied such practitioners one potential tool or focus for their workings. The cumulative effect of these beliefs was that mirrors in a house of mourning became objects of concern from multiple directions. They might trap the deceased soul. They might serve as entry points for other spirits. They might reveal unseen presences to those who were emotionally vulnerable. They might attract negative spiritual attention. Covering them addressed all these concerns simultaneously. It is worth observing that these beliefs took mirrors seriously as spiritually significant objects. This wasn't superstitious fear of an ordinary household item, but rather recognition that certain objects, by their nature and function, occupied important positions in the spiritual landscape of daily life. What we see in these beliefs is an understanding of death as creating a moment of spiritual danger and opportunity, requiring protective measures. Covering mirrors was one element of creating a protected space during this vulnerable time, shielding both the dead and the living from potentially harmful spiritual encounters. As evening deepens around us, we might simply hold this understanding of mirrors as objects that required careful management during times of transition. Objects whose reflective properties connected in complex ways to beliefs about spirits, souls, and the boundaries between different realms of existence. Let us shift perspective now to consider the practice from the viewpoint of those who remained alive, how covering mirrors related to the experience of the bereaved. The custom of covering mirrors wasn't only about protecting the dead or managing spiritual boundaries. It also addressed the psychological and emotional state of those who were grieving. This dimension of the practice reveals sensitivity to the particular vulnerabilities of people in mourning. Grief creates an altered state of consciousness. In the immediate aftermath of loss, the bereaved often report feeling disconnected from ordinary reality, moving through a fog, experiencing the world as strange or unreal. This disorientation is a normal part of the grieving process, but it creates particular vulnerabilities. In such a state, encountering one's own reflection could be disturbing in ways it wouldn't normally be. The person in the mirror looks the same, but everything feels different. The familiar face seems strange, almost unrecognizable. There's a disconnect between the image, which appears normal, and the internal experience of devastating change. Some traditions explicitly recognize this psychological dimension. They taught that seeing one's reflection during intense grief could be harmful. It might intensify the sense of disconnection, create fear, or simply feel wrong in ways difficult to articulate. There's also the matter of vanity and self-focus. Many mourning traditions emphasize that grief should be entirely focused on the deceased and on spiritual or familial duties, not on oneself. Mirrors, being tools for self-examination and grooming, represented a kind of self-focus inappropriate during mourning. Covering them removed the temptation or possibility of such self-regard. In Jewish tradition, this aspect is quite explicit. The shivah period is meant for mourning and reflection, not for attention to personal appearance. Covering mirrors helps mourners maintain focus on what is spiritually important, rather than on superficial concerns. The absence reflected in mirrors also held meaning. A household after death contains an absence. Someone who should be there is no longer present. Mirrors reflect this absence. The family gathered in a room shows, in reflection, who is missing. This visible absence, multiplied in mirrors throughout the house, could be painfully acute. By covering mirrors, the household avoided these constant visual reminders of absence. The reflections that showed who was no longer there were hidden. This provided some relief from the relentless awareness of loss that mirrors would otherwise reinforce. There's a practical dimension as well. In a household managing the immediate aftermath of death, preparing the body, arranging the funeral, notifying relatives, receiving visitors, there is no time or energy for normal grooming and self-care. People in such circumstances might look dishevelled, exhausted, tear-stained. Encountering these images of themselves in mirrors might add to their distress. Covered mirrors remove this additional burden. There was no need to confront one's own haggard appearance, no requirement to maintain normal standards of presentation to oneself. The covered mirrors provided a kind of privacy, allowing people to move through their grief without constantly seeing the physical toll it was taking. For children in the household, covered mirrors might serve an additional function. Children often struggle to understand death and may be frightened by the changes in routine and atmosphere. Covered mirrors, along with other alterations to the household, mark this as a special, different time. The visible changes help children understand that something important had happened, even if they couldn't fully grasp what death meant. The practice also created a shared experience among all household members. Everyone encountered the same covered mirrors. Everyone lived in the same altered domestic space. The shared physical environment reinforced the sense of collective mourning, of the household as a unit moving through grief together. When visitors came to offer condolences, the covered mirrors they encountered served as immediate visible markers of the household state. Before a word was spoken, the draped mirrors communicated that death had occurred here. This set appropriate expectations for behaviour and atmosphere. The eventual uncovering of mirrors marked a transition in the grieving process. This didn't mean grief was over. Mourning might continue for months or years, but it indicated that the most intense, acute phase was passing. The household was beginning to return to normal rhythms, even while carrying the weight of loss. Some people reported that uncovering mirrors felt significant, a conscious decision to re-engage with normal life, to resume attention to ordinary concerns like appearance and self-presentation. This ritual moment provided a marker in the otherwise undifferentiated time of grief. There's also something to be said about mirrors and identity. We construct our sense of self partially through our reflection, how we look, how we present ourselves to the world. In grief, identity can feel shaken or uncertain. Who am I now without this person? Removing mirrors temporarily perhaps acknowledged this disruption of identity, this period when self-understanding must be reconstructed. What we observe in this dimension of the practice is attention to the psychological needs of the bereaved. Whether consciously articulated or simply embedded in custom, mirror covering recognise that people in grief are in a vulnerable state requiring protection, not just spiritual protection, but psychological shelter as well. As we move deeper into the evening's quiet, we might reflect on how mourning practices often serve multiple functions simultaneously, addressing spiritual concerns while also creating practical and psychological frameworks for managing the immediate period after loss. Let us examine now how this practice manifested in different cultural and religious contexts, observing both the commonalities and the variations. In Victorian England and Europe generally, elaborate mourning customs reached their height in the 19th century. These formalised practices governed clothing, social activities, and household management for extended periods following a death. Mirror covering fit into this broader system of mourning protocols. Victorian mourning was highly stratified by the relationship to the deceased. A widow was expected to observe full mourning for a year or more, with gradually relaxing restrictions thereafter. Children, siblings, and other relations had different requirements. Within this system, mirror covering during the immediate post-death period was common, though not universal. The Victorian emphasis on visible markers of mourning meant that many practices served both spiritual and social functions. Covered mirrors marked the household as being in mourning to visitors and neighbours. This visible status communicated that normal social expectations were suspended and that the household required particular treatment. Victorian spiritualist movements, which flourished during this period, had complex relationships with mirrors. Some spiritualists believed mirrors could be tools for contacting the dead or for making spirits visible. This belief would reinforce the practice of covering mirrors after death, though for different reasons than traditional folk beliefs about soul trapping. In Jewish tradition, covering mirrors during shivah has clear religious foundations. The practice connects to the focus during shivah on spiritual rather than physical concerns. The 7-day period is meant for mourning, prayer and reflection, not for attention to personal appearance. Jewish law, halakha, doesn't explicitly require mirror covering, but the custom is widespread and deeply embedded in practice. Different Jewish communities have variations in how strictly they observe it. Some cover all mirrors and reflective surfaces, others cover only those in main living areas. The Jewish practice also connects to beliefs about the soul and its immediate post-death journey. The first 7 days after death are understood as a time when the soul is transitioning, and the mourning practices during this period serve both the living and the dead. In some parts of Eastern Europe, folk traditions maintain beliefs about mirrors and death that existed somewhat independently of formal religious frameworks. These folk beliefs often involve spirits, the evil eye, and various forms of protection against supernatural harm. Mirror covering was one element among many protective practices. Rural communities in various parts of Europe maintain their own local variations. The specific beliefs might differ, but the practice of covering mirrors appeared widely. This geographic distribution suggests either common ancient roots or independent development of similar practices addressing similar concerns about death and mirrors. In some Asian cultures, beliefs about mirrors and spirits also led to practices around mirrors at the time of death, though these might take different forms than European mirror covering. The specific cultural frameworks differed, but the recognition of mirrors as spiritually significant objects appeared across different traditions. Chinese tradition includes beliefs about mirrors and their spiritual properties. While the specific practices around death vary, mirrors are generally understood as having particular qualities in relationship to spirits and spiritual protection. This creates some parallel concerns to those found in European traditions. American practices largely followed European patterns, particularly among communities that maintained strong ties to their ancestral cultures. Irish American, Jewish American, and other immigrant communities often preserved the mirror covering customs they brought from their countries of origin. Over time, these practices have generally weakened in many communities. As belief systems changed, and as mourning customs generally became less formal and elaborate, mirror covering became less common. However, it persists in some communities, particularly those maintaining strong traditional religious practices. The persistence or decline of the practice varies considerably by community. Orthodox Jewish communities generally maintain the practice quite consistently. Some Christian communities continue it, others have let it lapse. Individual families make their own decisions based on their beliefs and their connection to traditional practices. Regional variations existed even within similar cultural contexts. What was standard practice in one area might be unknown in another, even when the communities shared the same basic religious or cultural background. This local variation reflects how customs are maintained and transmitted through specific communities, rather than through universal mandates. The reasons given for the practice could also vary within the same tradition. Some emphasize spiritual protection, others psychological benefits, others simply, it's what we've always done. This variety of explanations suggests that the practice could hold multiple meanings and serve multiple functions simultaneously. Modern practitioners of mirror covering may understand it quite differently than their ancestors did. Some maintain the practice for traditional or religious reasons while being skeptical of the literal spiritual beliefs that originally motivated it. Others practice it as cultural identity and connection to heritage rather than from conviction about souls and mirrors. What we observe across these various traditions is a practice that appeared in multiple forms across different cultural contexts, suggesting it addressed some fundamental human need or concern around death. The specific forms varied, but the basic impulse to modify the household environment, particularly reflective surfaces, in response to death, appeared broadly. As evening grows quieter, we might simply acknowledge this diversity while recognizing the common threads. The treatment of death as requiring special practices, the understanding of mirrors as significant objects, the creation of protected or marked space during mourning. Let us consider now the sensory experience of a household with covered mirrors, how this practice affected the atmosphere, the visual environment, and the overall quality of space during mourning. A house in mourning has a particular atmosphere that anyone who has experienced it recognizes immediately. There's a quality of stillness, a heaviness in the air, a sense that normal life has been suspended. The covered mirrors contribute to this atmosphere in specific ways. Light behaves differently in a room with covered mirrors. Ordinarily, mirrors multiply light, bouncing it around the space, creating a sense of openness and brightness. When mirrors are covered, this multiplication ceases. The room becomes darker, more enclosed. Natural light from windows no longer reflects and amplifies through the space. This dimming serves the atmosphere of mourning. Grief doesn't want brightness and cheer. The subdued lighting created by covered mirrors matches the subdued emotional state of the household. The physical environment reflects the internal experience of those inhabiting it. The texture of the covering fabric adds its own sensory element. Heavy black cloth absorbs light differently than white sheets. The way fabric drapes and folds creates its own visual interest, replacing the sharp, reflective quality of mirrors with soft, matte surfaces. These textural differences affect how the room feels to those within it. Covered mirrors also change the sense of space. Mirrors create visual depth, making rooms appear larger by showing reflected space. Without this reflection, rooms feel more contained, perhaps smaller. This containment might actually be comforting during mourning, creating a sense of enclosure and protection rather than the exposure of open reflective space. The silence of a house in mourning is another crucial element. Normal household activities, conversation, music, cooking sounds are reduced or eliminated. In this silence, any sound becomes noticeable. The rustle of fabric hanging over mirrors, moved by air currents, becomes part of the quiet soundscape. The absence of the subtle visual movement that mirrors capture also contributes to the overall stillness. Movement through the house takes on different quality. Ordinarily, we catch glimpses of ourselves in mirrors as we pass, constant small confirmations of our presence and appearance. Without these reflected glimpses, movement through space feels different. There's less visual feedback, less confirmation of self, creating a subtle disorientation that matches the larger disorientation of grief. For visitors entering the house, the covered mirrors are immediately noticeable. This visual marker communicates the household state before anyone speaks. The atmosphere has been physically altered, made visible through these draped surfaces. This allows visitors to adjust their behavior and expectations appropriately. The care with which mirrors are covered also matters. Hastily thrown cloth creates one impression, carefully draped fabric another. The attention given to covering mirrors, ensuring complete coverage, arranging fabric neatly or simply effectively, reflects the seriousness with which the practice is undertaken. In candlelight or lamplight, covered mirrors create different shadows and light patterns than uncovered mirrors would. The fabric surfaces don't reflect light sharply, but absorb or diffuse it. This creates a softer, more diffuse lighting environment that contributes to the contemplative atmosphere appropriate for mourning. The colour of covering fabrics affects the atmosphere as well. Black cloth creates deep darkness where mirrors once were. White sheets create pale, ghost-like presences where reflective surfaces had been. The choice of fabric colour contributes to the overall visual tone of the mourning space. Temperature and air movement interact with covered mirrors in subtle ways. Fabric hanging over mirrors creates slight changes in how air moves in a room. Heat that would reflect off glass now gets absorbed by fabric. These are small physical changes that cumulatively affect how the space feels to its inhabitants. The removal of mirrors as reference points also changes spatial awareness. We often orient ourselves partially by mirrors, checking appearance, gauging position in space. Without these reference points, the familiar becomes slightly unfamiliar. Rooms feel different to navigate, creating a subtle strangeness that marks the space as altered. Children moving through the house experience these changes acutely. Mirrors are often at child height, or children enjoy looking in mirrors. Covered mirrors remove these familiar interaction points, marking clearly that the household has entered a different state. Children's play might be affected by the absence of reflections. The cumulative sensory effect of covered mirrors, combined with other mourning practices, closed curtains, stopped clocks, quiet voices, restricted activities, creates an environment that feels separate from ordinary time and space. The household becomes a kind of protected enclosure, marked off from normal life while grief is most acute. The eventual uncovering of mirrors brings a sensory shift. Light suddenly multiplies again, reflections reappear, space opens up. This physical change marks the household's gradual return to normal patterns, though the emotional weight of loss continues. What we observe in these sensory dimensions is how physical practices create atmospheric effects that support emotional and spiritual purposes. The covered mirrors don't just serve symbolic functions, they actually change how the space looks, feels, and is experienced by those within it. As we settle deeper into the evening, we might simply observe how material changes to environment, the draping of fabric over glass, create profound shifts in atmosphere, supporting and expressing the profound emotional shifts that death brings to a household. As we approach the conclusion of this examination, let us consider how this practice exists in contemporary contexts and what psychological insights we might gain from it. The practice of covering mirrors continues in some communities today, though generally less widespread than in the past. Orthodox Jewish communities consistently maintain the practice during shivah. Some Christian families continue it, particularly those with strong ties to traditional practices. Other communities have largely let the custom lapse. The reasons for continuation vary. For some, it remains a genuine spiritual practice based on traditional beliefs about the soul and about mirrors. For others, it serves as cultural identity and connection to heritage, a way of maintaining practices that link them to previous generations and to their broader community. Some modern practitioners reinterpret the practice through psychological rather than spiritual frameworks. They may not believe that mirrors literally trap souls, but they recognize that covering mirrors serves psychological functions during grief. This reinterpretation allows the practice to continue with different justifications. The psychological interpretation emphasizes the protection of the vulnerable, bereaved from potentially disturbing experiences. Whether the dangers are spiritual or psychological, the protective function remains similar. Covered mirrors shield grieving individuals from encounters that might compound their distress. Modern grief counselling recognises that the immediate period after death is a time of particular vulnerability. The bereaved are in shock, disoriented, struggling with the reality of loss. Anything that might increase distress during this period is worth avoiding. From this perspective, covered mirrors make psychological sense even without spiritual beliefs. The practice also provides structure during a time when structure has collapsed. Death disrupts normal routines and patterns. Mourning practices, including mirror covering, create new patterns, temporary structures that help people navigate the period between death and the resumption of normal life. There's something to be said for the value of ritual action during crisis, having specific things to do, cover mirrors, stop clocks, notify relatives, arrange the funeral, provides focus and purpose when one might otherwise feel paralyzed by grief. The actions themselves become anchors in a disorienting time. The physical transformation of the household environment serves a marking function. The covered mirrors, along with other changes, make visible that this household is in a special state. This visibility helps both the inhabitants and visitors understand and respect the altered circumstances. Some contemporary observers note that our modern relationship with mirrors and self-image is quite different from that of earlier generations. We encounter our reflections constantly, in mirrors, in photographs, in video calls, in endless digital images. We may be more image conscious, but also more casually familiar with our reflections than people in the past. This modern relationship with mirrors might make the practice of covering them more or less meaningful. More meaningful because we're so dependent on visual self-reference that removing it would be a genuine disruption. Less meaningful because we might not notice the absence as acutely when we have so many other ways of seeing ourselves. The decline of the practice in many communities reflects broader changes in mourning customs. Western societies generally have moved toward less formal, less ritualized mourning. The elaborate Victorian protocols have been largely abandoned in favour of more individual, flexible approaches to grief. However, there are some signs of renewed interest in mourning rituals as people recognise the potential value of structured practices during grief. Some previously abandoned customs see revival or reinterpretation. The covered mirrors might find new relevance in contemporary mourning practices. Environmental and anthropological perspectives offer another lens. The practice represents one example of how humans modify their physical environment in response to emotional and spiritual needs. The urge to mark significant transitions through environmental changes appears across many cultures and practices. The symbolism of mirrors themselves remains rich in contemporary culture. Mirrors appear in literature, film, and art as symbols of self-reflection, truth, vanity, and the boundary between reality and delusion. This continued symbolic resonance suggests why practices involving mirrors maintain some cultural power. For those who've experienced the practice, either growing up in households that observed it or participating in it during their own bereavement, it often holds personal significance beyond any specific belief system. The memory of covered mirrors becomes associated with the experience of loss, creating powerful personal associations. The practice also raises questions about the relationship between belief and practice. Must one believe the literal spiritual explanations to find value in the practice, or can the practice be meaningful even if understood primarily symbolically or psychologically? Different individuals answer these questions differently. From a historical perspective, the widespread appearance of mirror covering across different cultures suggests it addressed something fundamental about the human experience of death and grief. Whether we interpret this in spiritual, psychological, or cultural terms, the practice clearly served important functions for many communities. The gradual decline of such practices raises questions about what, if anything, replaces them in modern life. Do we have other ways of marking death, of protecting the bereaved, of creating appropriate atmosphere for grief? Or have we lost something valuable in abandoning older mourning customs? What we observe in contemporary contexts is a practice in transition, maintained strongly in some communities, abandoned in others, reinterpreted in still others. This diversity reflects broader patterns in how traditional practices adapt or fail to adapt to changing beliefs and circumstances. As we settle into the final portion of Evening's Quiet, we might reflect on how this practice, covering mirrors when death occurs, represents one example of the human impulse to respond to death with ritual action, to create protected space during vulnerability, and to mark the profound transitions that death brings to both individuals and communities. As we complete this examination of mirror covering practices, let us gather these observations together. Over the hour, we have traced a practice that appeared across various cultures and time periods, the covering of mirrors in households where death had occurred. We have explored the beliefs that motivated this custom, the practical actions involved, the different cultural contexts where it appeared, the sensory and atmospheric effects it created, and its presence in contemporary life. The practice of covering mirrors served multiple functions simultaneously. It protected the deceased soul from becoming trapped or confused. It prevented unwanted spiritual presences from entering through mirrors as thresholds. It shielded the bereaved from potentially disturbing encounters with their own reflections or with unseen presences. It created appropriate atmosphere for mourning. It marked the household visibly as being in a special state. These various functions weren't mutually exclusive. A single practice could address spiritual concerns while also serving psychological needs and creating practical benefits. This multifunctionality helps explain why the custom appeared so widely, and persisted so long in many communities. What we observe across different cultural expressions of this practice is both diversity and commonality. The specific beliefs varied. Jewish traditions understood it differently than Victorian practices, which differed from Eastern European folk customs. Yet certain patterns recurred. Mirrors were treated as significant objects requiring special management at death. The immediate post-death period was understood as requiring protective practices. Modifying the household environment was seen as appropriate response to death. The sensory and atmospheric dimensions we explored reveal how physical practices create environments that support emotional and spiritual purposes. The dimming of rooms, the removal of reflection, the draping of fabric, these material changes produce spaces that felt appropriate for grief and mourning. The persistence of the practice in some communities today, alongside its decline in others, reflects broader patterns in how traditional customs adapt to changing beliefs and circumstances. Some find continued meaning in the practice, whether through traditional beliefs or through reinterpreted understandings. Others have let it go as their relationship to mourning customs has changed. For those who have experienced this practice, either observing it in childhood or participating in it during bereavement, it often holds particular resonance. The covered mirrors become part of the texture of memory around death and grief, creating associations that persist regardless of later beliefs about the spiritual mechanisms involved. As you settle into sleep this evening, you might simply rest with the recognition that humans across many cultures have created practices to mark death and support those who mourn. The covering of mirrors represents one such practice, a physical action that serves spiritual, psychological, and social functions, helping communities navigate the difficult transition that death brings. These practices remind us that death has always required response, ritual action, environmental modification, community support. The specific forms these responses take vary by culture and era, but the underlying need appears universal. Death disrupts normal life, and humans create practices to manage this disruption, to protect the vulnerable, and to mark the profound transition from life to death. May you rest well, with appreciation for the diverse ways communities have created meaning and structure around death, and with recognition of the human capacity to respond to loss with practices that honour both the dead and the living.